Okay, well, it's a pleasure to have with us today to talk about the question of self-determination in an ongoing series here in Peace in Kurdistan. We have with us Hawzhin Azeez, and like I said, it's an honor. Let's get started. Okay, at Peace in Kurdistan, we're interested in rethinking what the principle and practice of self-determination can and must mean for the 21st century. We are inspired by Abdullah Öcalan's impressive re-articulation of the concept along the lines of the project of democratic confederalism. Could you share with us your thoughts about what the struggle for self-determination is all about?
Yes. First of all, thank you so much, Thomas, for having me on. Your organization has been doing some really fantastic work, raising awareness about the Kurdish issue and what's been happening in Rojava, not just the Kurdish issue, but focusing on other oppressed and marginalized people across the world. So it's an absolute pleasure to be here. I would like to start off by prefacing this discussion with the fact that I spent about 4 years in Rojava helping with the rebuilding of Kobani and Qamishlu after the conflict that occurred with ISIS and the conflict that is still ongoing as a result of Turkish violence and incursions and land annexations. So firstly, that's what I'm about to say is based on the fact that I did witness what was happening in Rojava, which is basically symbolizes what the Kurdish movement is attempting to do right now, which is this effort towards greater collective freedom and liberation. For anyone who's new to the Kurdish issue, the Kurds have been violently oppressed and assimilated between 4 different countries, from Iran to Iraq to Syria to Turkey. In certain parts of what we call Greater Kurdistan, there is a certain level of autonomy and freedom, but there are overall significant efforts to encourage the Kurds and those that they live with to move towards a form of collective liberation and freedom. So the Kurds have been the victims of history. They are I would call them the orphans of history. They've been deliberately and officially and systematically denied their rights, their ability to live humanely, their ability to live with their culture, their language, music, dance, and so on and so on. I think to a certain extent in the 21st century, going through the global pandemic that we are for the third year now that we are in, we are extremely desensitized to the plight of the oppressed and the marginalized. And so when we make statements such as, well, the Kurds have been denied their basic rights, such as the right to freedom of their culture, their language, their identity, music, celebrations, and so on, it sounds like such a generic term, but the reality for many Kurds in Kurdistan has been extremely violent, extremely oppressive, and dehumanizing and alienating. So we know in the 21st century, as a result of the imposition of artificial and colonial nation-state models, the states of Iraq, for example, came into existence, Syria, Turkey, and so on. And many of these states had multiple different ethnicities or ethno-religious groups who were not part of the dominant groups who were in the majority. So in the nation-state model immediately encountered a major problem in the Middle East in the form of the Kurds and other, obviously, minorities. The solution, unfortunately, for the nation-state model has been one of authoritarianism, genocide, ethnic cleansing, basically pogroms, and significant use of violence to silence and erase and dehumanize minorities. The Kurds have been no exception to these. Armenians, the Greeks, the Christian communities, the Yazidis have all experienced similar situations, some far worse than others, in fact. For instance, the Yazidis have encountered over 75 genocides throughout their history, the majority of which have been in the last 200 years or so. So immediately we see that the nation-state model doesn't work for societies that are multicultural. And the solutions of many of these newly formed nation-states, supposed nation-states, was to impose a dominant identity. In Iraq, it was a Sunni Arab identity, even though the Sunni Arabs in the country made up of about less than 20% of the entire country. In Syria, it was a very similar entity. In Turkey, it was a very dominant nationalistic Turkish identity. All other ethnicities and languages were silenced. So wherever we have oppression and violence, people rise up because I think it's a natural reaction for humans to try to achieve freedom, to try to liberate themselves from any form of violence and oppression or hierarchies of power and erasure. And the Kurds have been no different. So in the last 100 years or so, since the imposition of the Sykes-Picot Agreement, the Kurds have been attempting to liberate themselves from the various states that have engaged towards them with extreme levels of violence and erasure. And so the current state of the Kurds at the moment in places such as Rojava, in South Kurdistan, Bashur, in Rojhelat and Bakur, Iran and Turkish parts of Kurdistan, respectively, we have significant efforts towards greater liberation, greater autonomy, a greater right to access one's language, to be able to teach in one's language, to be able to speak publicly in one's language, to teach our children. And so these are some of the most basic rights that in the 21st century are still being denied minorities and ethnicities or religious groups across the world. And so the Kurds are unfortunately one of the greatest examples of the negative impact of long-term violence. So from the very beginning, the Kurdish nationalist movement towards liberation was very much heavily focused on achieving a nation state of their own. The Kurds number well over 40 million, according to some very conservative figures. And so we're a very large group of people who are stateless. In fact, the largest group in the world who is stateless. And so for a very long time, and still to date, aspects of the Kurdish movements still envision a state as being the penultimate form of liberation for us Kurds. But another faction of the Kurdish liberation movement, which basically emerged as a result of Abdullah Öcalan's leadership in the Kurdish parts of Turkey and then in Rojava, which is the Kurdish parts of Syria, started to envision something differently. And this difference has been very, very significant. It has been very contentious. There's still a lot of discussion and dialogue internally within Kurdistan, within the different factions and movements, some who have readily accepted this new vision, some who continue to deny and reject the new vision. But ultimately, I think like any other oppressed minorities and groups, we desire a level of freedom, a level of autonomy to determine our own fate, to be the masters of our own souls and the captain of our own lives, to be able to live as most other people are living at the moment, to be able to dress in our national colors, to be not ostracized, violated, imprisoned, raped, murdered, executed, arrested, indefinitely disappeared, and so on, just for the crime of being a Kurd. And so the Kurdish question is obviously a very, very difficult one. It is one that is ongoing, but I think what we are seeing particularly through Rojava, we are seeing a new vision that can have serious and significant consequences internationally and for other minorities and oppressed people, and even for some of the so-called democratic and developed countries in the world. We are seeing in the 21st century, and as a result of the current global pandemic, that many of these so-called democracies are actually failing to cater to support and to take care of their own communities and societies. The system of capitalism and its various inequalities, of course, gender, sexuality, class, and so on, has resulted in significant amounts of questions rising up in relation to what is freedom and how do we envision freedom in the 21st century. So returning to the Kurdish issue, the struggle for self-determination for the Kurds is about freedom, first of all, but at least in the vision of democratic confederalism under the leadership of Abdullah Öcalan, this vision is one that isn't solely based on just the Kurds achieving their own freedom. There is absolutely no way in which the Kurds as an oppressed and violated minority can achieve freedom without taking into account the people that they have shared the lands with for eons, for centuries, and for millennia. And so freedom needs to be a collective one. I am not free so long as my neighbor is oppressed. I'm not free as a Kurd so long as my Yazidi, neighbor is being violated. I'm not free so long as the Christian communities are oppressed. I am not free as a Kurd so long as there is fascist and violent and oppressive mechanisms within our communities, within our societies, and even within our own psyches and our own bodies in the private home as well. So it's a very complex struggle, but it's a really, really beautiful and powerful example of the capacity of human beings to try to envision an entirely new world. And I think going back to the global pandemic in the 21st century and what we are seeing through neoliberal capitalist systems and their failures and the struggles of people to liberate themselves, we are seeing that this is very, very urgently needed. It's absolutely necessary. It is something that is non-negotiable, and it is something that we are all invested in, and it's not something that is solely related to just the Kurdish question or the Kurds trying to liberate ourselves. The very liberation of the Kurds is related to the international community's understanding of concepts such as self-determination, freedom, human rights, gender equality, ecology, and environmentalism. So yeah, I could go on, Thomas.
Yeah. I can see. A very, very, very eloquent introduction to the conversation. Let me push ahead a little bit on this related themes. So you've written, and I quote, that through Murray Bookchin, Öcalan produced the theory of democratic confederalism and came to the conclusion that the Kurds' efforts to acquire a state of their own would not be the ultimate solution to their liberation. Could you elaborate for us a little bit more how you conceive of the influence of Bookchin upon Öcalan?
Well, we know that Abdullah Öcalan was incarcerated and in prison in 1999 as a result of an international conspiracy. Not only being stateless, but he went to multiple different countries such as Russia, Greece, Italy, and eventually Kenya. And he was denied basically asylum. And so he ended up being in jail. And this year, it's been 23 years that Abdullah Öcalan has spent in extremely adverse conditions on the island prison of Imrali, who, he's, for the majority of this time, he's been the sole occupant of this island. So Abdullah Öcalan, it is widely thought that Abdullah Öcalan discovered Murray Bookchin and some of these Western intellectuals and philosophers that he was inspired with during his stay in prison. But actually there's evidence, Thomas, that he was thinking of an alternative perspective as far as the early 1990s, and in 1998, before he was imprisoned in 1999, he advocated that he was looking at a different way of providing a solution or envisioning a solution for the Kurdish question in the Middle East, which included a stateless one, which included one that focused on autonomy, self-determination, rather than secession and separatism. So once he was obviously in prison, there was a lot of time being the sole occupant of an island prison in inhumane conditions and situations for him to reconsider some of the questions in relation to the Kurdish issue. I think it's very important to advocate that Abdullah Öcalan was going through a process of self-analysis, self-criticism, and revision of the Kurdish liberation movement up to that point. And he wanted to create a very self-aware doctrine or manifesto, which openly advocated or openly highlighted where mistakes had been made. And so I think for me personally, as an academic and as a feminist, this is one thing that is very much in alignment with who Murray Bookchin was as an American philosopher and intellectual, and one of the founding fathers of the modern environmentalist movement. Murray Bookchin, in his own personal efforts, also went through a particular process, an ongoing process of revision of his ideology and his values and his political alignment. For example, moving away famously from anarchist movement and moving more towards a social ecology perspective. So Öcalan was going through a very, very similar process, and as a result of reading multiple different academics and intellectuals, from Wallerstein to Murray Bookchin to Nietzsche, as well as various other feminist groups, or women rather, such as Maryam Yes, who was a sociologist and a feminist, and her writing on the way in which women have been oppressed historically significantly impacted Abdullah Öcalan. We know that the seeds of democratic confederalism already existed in the PKK, in the Kurdish liberation movement. We had seen earlier that entire women's movement and military factions were being created. There were entire groups of women who were working independently of the men. So the seeds of some of these liberation aspects of democratic confederalism already existed. But I think through Murray Bookchin, various unanswered questions kind of came together for Abdullah Öcalan, and he managed to create a far more comprehensive and detailed analysis, a more clear and concise and more succinct blueprint of what the Kurds needed to do in order to liberate themselves. Not only liberate themselves from the oppression of being a violently erased minority, but also from the hierarchical and oppressive bureaucratic processes of the nation state model as well. So as a result of reading Mari Bookchin and seeing Mari Bookchin's significant focus on environmentalism, on seeing how Mari Bookchin was very much focused on removing hierarchies of oppression and violence, it really, really influenced Abdullah Öcalan. The ecology of freedom was very, very significant. The urbanization without cities, some of these texts are foundational to the concept of democratic confederalism. So just to backtrack a little bit, Mari Bookchin is very much a social ecologist, and he focused on the concept of creating libertarian municipalism. He was very much focused on removing ideas around hierarchy. And in fact, in, I think, the ecology of freedom, he advocates a very, very important point about being focused on various hierarchies of oppression and violence that exist aside from within the capitalist state-centric model. And this is very much aligned with this concept of intersectionality as advocated by Black feminists such as Kimberly Crenshaw, who pioneered or at least forwarded the concept of intersectional feminism and awareness of how different forms of oppression and violence intersect and impact individuals and societies and communities. So Bookchin argued that it was very, very important that we fight against this capitalist oppressive society, because all forms of domination and hierarchies of power and oppression within a capitalist society form together to create domination of human beings. And unless we liberated our environment, liberated our ecological environment, there was no way in which any form of liberation could ever be formulated or structured or even envisioned. So Mari Bookchin was very, very obviously focused on the connection between how there's an ecological and environmental crisis and its connection to the capitalist society. And so we had to be very aware as individuals and as society collectively that if we wanted to change the way in which things have always existed, we needed to create a different social structure in which the individual and the community is empowered to make decisions for themselves, for people to be reconnected to the land, and for them to see that it was completely possible to take back and reclaim not only our identities, but also the land along the process as well. So having been inspired by this aspect of Mari Bookchin's writing, Abdullah Öcalan formulated democratic confederalism as a theory and as a practice, which is currently being most obviously implemented in Rojava. So Mari Bookchin has been very, very significant. I think Abdullah Öcalan also, as Kurds, being aware of the fact that we are very conscious of the fact that often Western and international leftist groups and philosophers and academics often sort of take away the agency of Öcalan, take away the agency of the Kurdish liberation movement, and strongly advocate that there was absolutely no form of consciousness in relation to the environment, in relation to women's liberation, in relation to removing hierarchies of power and oppression, and rejecting the state within Öcalan and within the Kurdish liberation movement. I've argued that this is not so, and that Öcalan and the Kurdish liberation movement did have the seeds of some of these core aspects of democratic confederalism. It's just that when Abdullah Öcalan came across Mari Bookchin, the connections were made stronger. The environment became the foundational aspect of the liberation of a people, and therefore it became sort of a bottoms-up form of liberation as opposed to a top-down form of liberation, where achieving the state was the penultimate way of liberating a community. Bookchin and Öcalan have produced an incredible theory of liberation for the oppressed and the marginalized. and even again for some of the most democratic and so-called developed societies across the world, in helping us to address some of the inequalities, hierarchies of oppression, violence, patriarchal practices, sexism, racism, and so on, that still exist across all of our societies.
Again, very eloquent, very eloquent. Thank you very much for that. So pushing ahead a bit further, you've mentioned a bit about the influence of Miley Azeez and the Bielefeld School on Öcalan's thought.
Yes.
How does the struggle against patriarchy relate to the struggle for self-determination, both in theory and in the practice of the Kurdish freedom movement?
They are very, very much intimately interconnected. There can be no form of self-determination and freedom without eradicating the patriarchal practices, not only physically within our societies, institutionally within our communities, but also within our own psyches and attitudes as individuals as well. So there's absolutely no speaking of one without the other. And I think we've seen, especially in the last 2 decades or so, with the Kurdish liberation movement having their own separate women's movements, as well as in Rojava with the very famous YPG, the Women's Protection Units, we see that this discussion around eradication and the smashing of the patriarchy taking deeper root and becoming a central tenet of the kind or the vision of liberation for the Kurdish people. So in discussing democratic confederalism, there are 3 main pillars, so-called pillars, that hold up this blueprint of democratic confederalism. And obviously there's direct democracy, there's ecological protection, and of course the 3rd pillar is gender equality and removing patriarchal practices within society, not only within men themselves, but also within the psyche and attitudes and the values that women themselves hold as well. We've seen through the ideology of the YPG that they will continue to fight for women's rights within their own communities, for their own rights, protecting their own rights physically if they must with the weapons that they hold, but also against the men in their own communities. So an entity such as the YPG isn't just a mindless militia group who is fighting and is a tool of oppression and the tool of the nationalist movement and being utilized to fight back against ISIS. The fight against ISIS actually has only been a secondary objective of the YPG. The main objective is the fight against capitalist patriarchal state and the liberation of themselves and their fellow women within their own communities. So even when ISIS was supposedly eliminated, which obviously we know is far from the truth, the YPG continue to function. They are a very powerful, symbolic reflection of the changes that we want within society. How could we eliminate all forms of hierarchies of oppression if we have women, being oppressed and violated? So Maria Mayes has a very famous book called Woman, the Last Colony, which was published in 1988. And
First colony.
First colony.
Yeah.
Is it the first colony or the last colony? I saw it as the last colony.
I think it's the first
And
colony.
basically Abdullah Öcalan was very taken by this idea. And so he takes this idea and he focuses on the fact that the foundation of the Kurds' freedom is based on women. And unless women are actively participating in the liberation of the community, there can be no form of collective liberation. But not only that, we've seen in the last century or so many various women's groups and organizations, some militant, some civil organizations who have come out and participated in the national liberation efforts of various groups and entities. We've seen it in Iran, very famously. We've seen it in Algeria, we've seen it in Lebanon, we've seen it in Iraq. Unfortunately, the tendency is when we don't address patriarchal practices, many of the contributions of these women, their sacrifices are immediately post-liberation forgotten, erased, and basically silenced. And the women are in many instances pushed not only back into the private domain of the home, but many of the pre-liberation laws, which may have been slightly more pro-woman, have been eradicated. And the movement has actually become significantly more patriarchal than the previous authoritarian regime that a particular community was attempting to liberate themselves from. So learning from history is a very important aspect of the kind of liberation envisioned by the Kurdish women. In fact, we have our own branch of feminism that has emerged in the last decade or so, which is called genealogy, which is basically the science of woman. And basically, genealogy argues that we have to go back through history. We have to reanalyze the role of women. Women have been one of the most oppressed, have been the most oppressed community throughout history. And unless women reclaim their lost voice and position within society, we can never, ever achieve any form of freedom and equality or self-determination. As is possible if we obviously include all different communities and ethnicities. And I think for this very reason, multiculturalism is a very strong aspect of the kind of liberation that we are envisioning in the Kurdish movement. So patriarchy, genealogy, seeing women being available and very much free in the public sphere, participating in the political, economic, military, and the various aspects of the public sphere is very, very empowering. You know, Thomas, like I said in the beginning of our chat, I spent 3 to 4 years in Rojava helping with the rebuilding, and there is nothing more empowering as a woman to see other women freely walking around in the community, the YPG in their uniform, holding weapons, and it creates a sense of confidence within women. But of course, it's, you know, this eradication of the patriarchal practices isn't just a military one, it's a lot more complex than that. We have established various institutions and organizations to help contribute to the eventual and organic and long-term eradication of patriarchal practices. We have things like the women's houses, Malajin, which are houses in every neighborhood where women can go to seek legal advice, psychological support, a place of safety, a place where women can come to in relation to domestic violence, inheritance, marriage issues, forced marriages, child marriages, anything that relates to gender, that the woman can seek support and advice and solidarity from people who are experts in their fields. We have the co-chair positions as well, where any position of power or ministry must entail one male, one female member or in a position of leadership. We have women who are very much active and leaders in the cooperatives and the communes. There are women-only cooperatives, which are encouraging women to become more independent, financially independent, especially those who have been widowed or who have traditionally relied on men within their families to support them. So what's happening in Rojava as a result of this feminist resurgence is very, very powerful. It should be a very important and interesting and revolutionary experience. And I think not only just all women across the world, all feminists across the world, but anyone who is interested in democracy, in human rights, in liberation of the oppressed and the silenced and erased, the wretched of the earth, so to speak, should be watching what the women are doing in places such as Rojava, watching them very, very closely, because they're at the forefront of this dialogue about liberation and self-determination and freedom.
Excellent. Again, eloquent.
Thank you.
So with respect to the role of social ecology, how do you see the role of social ecology in particular in the struggle for self-determination? And specifically, what are the main challenges to advancing an ecological society in the Kurdish context?
Self-determination, social ecology, very much like, gender equality is foundational to this vision of democratic confederalism. We cannot, again, envision collective liberation for us all if we are violating the earth and we are violating the land that we live on. So social ecology is very, very important in order for us to create a society which is healthy, physically, psychologically, emotionally, intellectually, and a society that is able to make decisions holistically and in a way that is for the benefit of the collective rather than the interest of a few elite groups within society. So the social ecology struggle is very much foundational to the Kurdish struggle. There are multiple different challenges that that the ecological society is faced in Kurdistan. Having experienced what was happening in Rojava, there are various barriers, most interestingly in the form of the border issues that prevent various humanitarian, various aid, various solidarity movements, groups, and supplies from actually entering Rojava and being able to have an influence. Across the rest of Kurdistan, we see significant challenges mainly from the bureaucracy of the states, which are very much focused on implementing further violence and erasure on the Kurdish people. How could a society be ecological? How could a society be social? How could a society be able to live in a healthy way with the land, with the various groups and people that it coexists with, if people aren't able to simply dress in their cultural clothes, or if people like recently Zahra Mohammadi in Rojhelat, the Kurdish part of Iran, has been imprisoned for 5 years for daring to teach young children the Kurdish language. So social ecology is about creating a society which is healthy across multiple different levels, politically, socially, and economically. It's about creating a society which has a deep respect with the land and sees that the oppression and the hierarchies of violence towards the land only creates and produces further violence, further oppression, further erasure. And so as minorities across the world, as the oppressed, as the silenced, we are, as the Kurdish people, very, very much dedicated to this environmentalist resurgence connection with our land. Because at the heart of it all, this liberation is calling for our right to live peacefully, safely, and humanely on the land. But if the land is destroyed, if the land is violated and burnt, then there's no way in which we can achieve this vision of collective liberation. So environmental protection is very much a part of this process. The status nation-state model across the international community is a significant barrier against this. Recently, I was asked if Turkey was one of the major barriers that prevented this social ecological society from emerging. And I would actually argue that Turkey is simply a tool of the international capitalist system. I would argue that the hegemonic power of the United States is actually more determined and more invested, far, far, far more than Turkey is even capable of analyzing or understanding, against this social ecologist model that is being implemented in Rojava, because this social ecologist model is the antithesis, the response to this neoliberal capitalist violence that we are experiencing in the pandemic era. And so there are significant barriers, but nevertheless, we know that as human beings, we are incredibly powerful. We are capable of great changes and progress. We've seen through the influence of Öcalan and Bookchin that no matter how dedicated we are, how committed we are, how colonized our minds and bodies may be in acceptance of various oppressive structures such as capitalism or patriarchy or anti-environmentalist practices, that it is very, very much possible for people to change and for us to progress towards a more humane and more just society that respects the land that we live in, that takes into consideration that the land is actually part of our community and not simply a tool for domination and oppression to be used at our will and whim as human beings.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for that answer again. Let me ask you about Rojhelat. So you're from the Iranian part of Kurdistan, or Rojhelat. Could you talk to us a little bit about the particular difficulties experienced in the Kurdish struggle for self-determination there?
So the Iranian government is a very, very, very powerful enemy. In Turkey, we've seen, figureheads such as Erdogan constantly saying the Kurds don't exist, openly advocating their, anti-Kurdish stances. In Iran, it's a little bit more diplomatic. It's a little bit more insidious. And what we are seeing is the Iranian government has said, look, this part of Iran is called Kurdistan. We know that Kurds exist. We know that Arabs and Azeris and Turkmens and different communities and people exist. You have the right to exist, but you don't have the right to ask for further human rights, or you don't have the right to advocate for greater autonomy and self-determination. And so we are seeing a very, very different forms of violence and oppression being implemented towards the Kurds in Rojhelat. Iran is one of the top 3 executors of political activists, feminists, environmentalists, and basically any dissidents who dare to speak against the government. So the use of executions is a very, very powerful, visible, and terrifying tool that the Iranian government wields arbitrarily and at will. Another very, very obvious aspect of the violence the Iranian government implements towards the Kurds is through economic degradation, lack of economic development deliberately towards the Kurdish regions, forcing people to engage in various types of labors, which are basically extremely violent practices, such as the kolbers, who are people that carry heavy loads and cross the border between Iran into Iraq and try to sell their goods. These kolbers are constantly executed, constantly shot at, and even if they are not directly facing the dangers of the border guards, the young people, the people who are forced to become kolbers often freeze to death. There isn't a week or two that goes by that we don't see a tragedy occurring as a result of these desperate Kurds trying to make a living for themselves. Any political expression outside of the confines of what the Iranian government wants is immediately subject to arbitrary disappearances, imprisonment, and lengthy kangaroo court type situations where people are basically imprisoned for long periods of time. And of course, we need to constantly go back to the gender issue as well. And we know that when women end up in the Iranian prisons, they are immediately subjected to significant amounts of sexual violence as well. So the women face an added layer of oppression and violence aside from being Kurds, that of course men obviously are faced with sexual violence, but the implications are far different socially and culturally within the community in relation to women being sexually violated and oppressed. So the situation for the Kurds is actually very dire. There have been repeated humanitarian disasters as a result of earthquakes, which occur regularly on the region, which is the Kurdish parts of Iran, and the government has deliberately withheld aid, has pretended to send aid, but has actually redirected it to other areas. So the Kurds are facing a government which is very, very insidious and very much diplomatic in the way that it approaches the Kurds. It's not so blatantly obvious in relation to relative to countries such as Turkey, for example, but it is nevertheless very much against any form of autonomy, self-determination for any ethnicity. And again, it's not just the Kurds who are calling for greater freedom and rights within the region. It's various different other ethnic minorities and religious minorities as well. The region itself, unfortunately, is prone towards authoritarianism. And I think the nation state model, this colonial practice that was imposed on the region, has really exacerbated the level of violence that has continued on for decades and decades towards minorities. And I think a solution can only be envisioned in which we no longer see the liberation of a particular minority in the form of a state such as Iran or Turkey or Syria or Kurdistan or the land of the Yazidis, but one in which there is respect for humanity, respect for the land, respect for communities. And I think one of the most violent aspects of the colonial nation-state model and its imposition on the region has been establishing this deep-seated fear of multiculturalism. That the more multicultural you are, the more violent and oppressive, the more genocidal you have to be as a state. And I think what democratic confederalism, this aspect of the Kurdish liberation movement, has done is actually remove the stigma around multiculturalism and sees this mosaic of different cultures and ethnicities and ancient languages and ancient peoples coexisting peacefully and harmoniously on the land together, as they have for decades and centuries, and for basically since the beginning of time. So I think the positive from this process, from what the Kurdish people are experiencing in Iran, is that there is hope. There's an alternative available. There's a possibility of implementing a new way of coexisting with one another. The Kurdish part of Iran is actually one of the most environmentally active in comparison to the rest. It's very much focused on protecting the land. People have come together and formed civil society groups. Both of the government of Iran and Turkey tend to regularly use the land against the people by basically torching the ancient forest that the Kurds reside within and around. And so people have come together to form solutions of liberation, solutions to these acts of violence, because the governments are very much silent, if not deliberate, deliberately involved in some of the violences, including environmental destruction that is being imposed on the Kurds.
So now to shift focus a little bit, you live in Iraqi Kurdistan now. Could you comment on the level of appeal and the limits to it of Öcalan's paradigm there?
I think there are a number of problems in seeing the appeals of Öcalan's paradigm here in South Kurdistan. South Kurdistan has, like the various other parts of Kurdistan, has its own separate trajectory and history in relation to liberation. We've experienced the genocidal Anfal campaign. We've seen the Halabja bombings. We've seen decades of activism and the Peshmerga trying to formulate liberation for the Kurds here. And so in South Kurdistan, in Bashur, there's a whole dynamic at play, which is very different to the rest of the, at least to Rojava and to Bakur, the Syrian and the Turkish parts of Kurdistan. And so I think there are a few barriers, but there are also a few positives at play here. The Bashur region has been very much involved in the neoliberal capitalist campaign by outside forces such as America and Germany and France and obviously Turkey as well. So there are a lot of financial investments and businesses and organizations in place in the south of Kurdistan, which naturally acts as a barrier against the implementation of a more socialist communal form of coexistence. So that's a huge barrier. I think the Kurds in South Kurdistan, especially with the various two major political parties, such as the PUK, for example, see themselves as the natural inheritors of the Kurdish liberation movement. And their vision is very much in alignment with the traditional nationalist, very much patriarchal vision, traditional vision of national liberation involving the liberation of the people by having a state of their own. In fact, in late 2017, the government here held a referendum calling for the formation of a Kurdish state being formed, which had significant support, but also a lot of opposition within the Kurdish people as well. And I think another aspect is that the financial involvement of the Turkish government in this area has really curtailed the capacity of independent movements and organizations from coming out and advocating support for the concept of democratic confederalism. I think the people of South Kurdistan, Bashur, are extremely exhausted politically. They gave a lot of lives and they lost a lot during the liberation movement on efforts against Saddam Hussein, which was extremely, extremely violent, and basically responded to any form of Kurdish liberation with disproportionate levels of force and oppression. And so the Iraqi Kurdistan is very much focused on this internalized, colonized mentality of the neoliberal system. It's very much part of that system, and it very much lacks the capacity to be a little bit more self-critical. And even if you wanted to, the dominance of the two political parties prevents, again, independent movements and organizations from emerging and from moving towards an alternative vision. There are various women's organizations or leftist organizations or environmentalist organizations that advocate for Öcalan's paradigm here, but they face significant barriers and limitations. They've been arrested. In fact, in the last decade or so, 2 decades, there's been increasing moves to erase freedom of speech, prevent journalists from being critical of the government. Activists are disappearing. People are imprisoned, even if they are protesting against the government not providing them with their salaries, which is basically a basic responsibility of the government. So unfortunately, what we are seeing in Iraqi Kurdistan is a move towards an increasing authoritarian perspective, which, according to political theory and philosophy, is not surprising, because we know that post-colonial societies tend to replicate the kind of systems that existed previous to liberation. So the Iraqi government is very much recycling particular practices and attitudes and values towards its society that existed previously in the Ba'athist regime. Again, there's so much been written about this. Democratization is a long, slow process. And we see that, in places such as Rojava, Abdullah Öcalan was present for at least a decade in Rojava in Syria. And so the foundation of democratic confederalism existed in Rojava and in Bakur of Kurdistan for decades before the 2012 Syrian conflict emerged and the Kurds started to formulate their own communes and cooperatives and cantons. So I think in the last, at least 2003 or at least until 1991, where the autonomous fly zone area was created in South Kurdistan, we've seen an increased effort towards a neoliberal capitalist patriarchal ideology. And this was as a result of any lack of alternative. I think the dominant difference between Iraqi Kurdistan and the rest of Kurdistan and Öcalan's paradigm, followers of Öcalan's paradigm, is that the Iraqi Kurdistan political parties and movements lack a cohesive and coherent ideology. They are simply repeating the same old practices and traditions that have always existed. Political parties consist of old men who have been in the movement for decades and decades. The youth find it incredibly difficult to break out into political parties or to have a say. And it's basically an old men's club where women are basically tokenistic, symbolic indications of a level of freedom and liberalism within Kurdish society here. Of course, we've seen in the last decade or so again that as a result of the rise of social media and information technology, that the young people are really trying to curve their own space. We are seeing increased visibility of queer communities, for example. Women are becoming a lot more visible, participating in creating businesses and speaking out more publicly, which is huge and very, very significant because Iraqi Kurdistan tends to be one of the most patriarchal areas of Kurdistan. So there are positives and there is hope. And it is possible to see, and there are a lot of youth who have taught here, who have communicated with, who are interested in what's happening in Öcalan's or at least in Rojava. But I think another impact of the colonial nation state model is that we are all colonized and we have internalized and have accepted the oppression that, in South Kurdistan, we're the only Kurds. The other Kurds are, no, they're just Turks, no, they're just Syrians, they speak a different language, even though we speak Sorani, the Sorani dialect here mostly, and in Rojava they speak the Kermanji dialect. So there's a lack of self-awareness in the other parts of Kurdistan. We are so quick to dismiss the capacity and the rights of other Kurds existing and the fact that they are very much going through the same process of self-liberation and that it's possible for us to learn from each other. Unfortunately, the patriarchal political elite in this region is very, very much invested in maintaining traditional, tribal, patriarchal and conservative practices. And it's all about maintaining their own positions and corruption and power and authority, as opposed to actually thinking about the liberation of the people, which is the main difference about in relative to Öcalan's paradigm. Öcalan's paradigm is all about the people. It's not about him as a leader. It's about liberating the people. Yeah.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you for your time. Do you have any last words for our audience?
Well, it seems very presumptuous that I should have any words because I think we're all going through a struggle, an internal, individual, and also a collective struggle during the current pandemic, which we've been experiencing for the last 2 years now. I think we are all in a position where we are seeing what works and what doesn't work. We are realizing that community matters far more than some of these capitalist practices. Institutions and organizations are not going to come and save us from the pandemic. The banks aren't going to save us. It's the community aid organizers. It's the people who are coming together and providing support for the most marginalized, for the homeless, for the queer community, for transgender people, for people who are basically left out of the system. And so we are seeing various practices and organizations and people coming together. And I think that is so incredibly powerful and helpful. Having grown up in the West and having experienced what the revolution was like in Rojava, at times it's very easy for us to fall in a state of hopelessness, to feel like there's no way we can change the system. It's just so powerful. It's just so entrenched that any alternative would take a violent revolution. It doesn't actually have to take a violent revolutions. Individuals are capable of enacting revolutions on a daily basis in their own psyches, in their own bodies, in their own homes, in their communities, with each other. And I think the global pandemic has really reminded us of the need for our humanity, for our collective need to come together, to support each other, to be there for each other, to share food, to share spaces, to share our homes, to share our thoughts and ideas and our collective love. So I think Rojava is just but one example of the alternative that exists. And although you may disagree with aspects of it, and certainly there are limitations and there are problematic elements in this social experiment that is occurring in Rojava, it is possible just by knowing that an alternative exists that we can be inspired in our own communities to see that it is possible for us to live in an entirely different world, and that we can create cooperatives and communes and groups that can come together and together at the local level establish different ways of coexisting with one another. So the pandemic doesn't have to be this frightening, terrifying reminder of how hopeless we are, how incapable of change we are. Rather, it can be a catalyst for all of us to decolonize our minds, to sit with ourselves in the quiet and in the silence, but also in the community with each other, holding hands, even if we must cry together, and support each other in a time of extreme crisis, but also a time where there are so many opportunities for us to become more humane, more loving, more supportive of our communities, and to be there for one another.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Thank you for, again, thank you for everything.
You're very welcome. I hope I didn't speak too fast. I tend to speak very, very